theology book, like,
yeah.
like deeply about what it means for them, or actually what they were doing, or he was doing.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk a little more about that? Yeah. It's really amazing stuff. I'm really interested in this aspect of it, actually, because obviously, right? But also because, so when I started doing this project, I read a couple of like histories of the Liberation Theology Church, histories of the base Christian community movement. There's a really good book that talks about Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Chile, and the movement in the 60s and 70s there. And the Jesuits have a whole lot to do with liberation theology. We're the architects of this new way of thinking about theology. But what's fascinating is that in those books, right, so it's always, in a lot of the books I read anyway, it's this top-down sort of, so there were these Jesuits who had great ideas, and they were amazing. And then there were base Christian communities. And what I found as I investigated each of these steps, really, the like early Vatican II stuff, the base Christian community stuff, the later more Medellin, more intense liberation theology stuff, is that there were always nuns there doing that damn work 5 years earlier. You know? It's not, they were always doing that first. They weren't doing the intellectual work, right? They weren't in the universities. So the theologians, who are amazing people, and amazing people with like great cred, right? Who were certainly not ivory towered kinds of people, if we're talking about John Sobrino or something, or any of them, or Ernesto Cardenal, or whatever. Like it's not to take anything away from the absolutely unbelievably brilliant and humane and fantastic Jesuits, but the nuns were doing that. So for a long time, one of my kind of facetious questions to myself was this: when did the nuns go bad? When did, you know, if you're thinking as Somoza, right? So Somoza came to Ciuna, to this gold mining town, in the mid-60s to kind of inspect the mine and visit the Canadian leaseholder, and he was received in the church, right? Of course, they had a big to-do for him, and the sisters all lined up in their beautiful habits, and they sang the Te Deum for him. It's a Latin hymn that is like sung at a coronation, and they sang like however many verses of that in Latin for Somoza, and then Mora served him tea, likely on the china that her mother had sent her. So that's happening in like the mid-60s. And so they're these nice little nuns. They're like the flower of the church. They provide great scent, right? They provide this loveliness that Somoza clearly is like, oh yeah, let me like stand next to the nuns and look good. They're teaching poor people, right? Which people still do. So they're doing that in the mid-60s. And then by 1972, she's occupying the cathedral to call for Somoza's deposing, right? She's sleeping overnight with the youth group in the cathedral saying, you gotta go. And so I was like, how does that happen? Because she wasn't a big intellectual. Like, she wasn't somebody who like at night sat down and read theology. At night she like worked out the discussion questions for the next day's meeting. You know, like that just wasn't her way of being, to be like reading this really brainy stuff. So this was like an obsession for about a year. Like, how do you get from here to here before Medellin? Actually, before Medellin. And that's what's been important for me to think about. Like, Medellin didn't just like come out of nowhere. It wasn't like Pentecost, right? People have been thinking these things. And so it's actually like Vatican II, earlier, adult formation, talk to people, and then Paulo Freire, Brazilian radical educator. The nuns were reading Paulo Freire. Mora probably wasn't, because she wasn't the one in the house who was going to be doing that, but somebody else in the house was reading that stuff and organizing their like go talk to the miners' wives meetings around Paulo Freire radical education methodologies. Stuff's going to happen when that's how you're orienting yourself. Yeah. There's also this book. It was published in 1963, so like early during the council, by a Belgian theologian called A Nun in the World. And it's one of the things that I think shaped whatever that Vatican II document is on religious congregations. And it's all about that you need to come out. You need to come out of the convent, you need to come out of the cloister, you need to be out in amongst the people and not separated from the people. And the nun who was the head of the Maryknoll order, they were still called Mother Superiors at the time, she sent a copy of that book to every single Maryknoll house in the world. So if you're on an island in Micronesia with one other sister running a health clinic, or you're in Ciúna in the gold mining town, or you're in Brazil with a leper colony, every Maryknoll house got a copy of this book. And it's an amazing, it's really dry and it seems really old-fashioned and it's all sorts of things, but it's actually like a book that changed the world, if you think about it. So it was amazing to read. But anyway, long way of saying liberation theology is all about, they were all about liberation theology. Maura was all about liberation theology. Maybe a more succinct story is that when she was back in the US in the late 70s doing this, they called it reverse mission, right? So the nuns went out to the world to, once upon a time, the idea is that they were bringing God to heathens or bringing God to bad Catholics. Once they got there, they're like, oh, right, no, God's already here. Let's do what we can for these people. But then they had this reverse mission where you would come home and tell middle-class US people what you'd learned, which is a really amazing thing to do, right? So there'd be a little meeting in your parish in Newton, Massachusetts, and these nuns who've been in Nicaragua for 15 years are going to tell you about what life's like for Nicaraguans. During that time, she made friends with these other Peace and Justice Commission people through another diocese. And so I talked to this woman, Mary Heidkamp, who was in this Peace and Justice movement. It's all this immediately post-Vatican II, so much energy, so much hope, so much really explicit justice talk from the hierarchical church. So she bought that woman the Gospel of Solentinami and said, you should read this. And that's after Ernesto has left. So that's pretty intense stuff, right? She's spreading the Gospel of Solentinami, which is this, if you haven't read it, you should go read it or read parts of it. It's a group of Nicaraguan people living in an artist colony in the middle of a lake in Nicaragua, reading the gospel and discussing it, and it's supposed to be read as here's what the conversation was, here's what Carlos says, here's what Juan says, here's what he thinks the story's about, and it's just unbelievably politically radical reading of the gospel. And so Maura it had just been published in the late 70s in English in the US by Orbis, and she made sure that people got that book. The Gospel of Solentinami is the name of this little intentional community. It's Ernesto Cardenal. So I talked to a lot of sisters about liberation theology, and interestingly, they had we were doing that. We weren't writing it or thinking it or giving lectures or figuring out how it fit into the long tradition of academic theology. That's just what we did. But Maura was part of San Pablo the Apostle in Managua, the first base Christian community in Managua, from which all these other things grew. And she was with them in these kind of hot debates in that parish in the fall of '69, when the parish priest and an older nun were like, well, should we be more churchy or should we be more in the street? And she was even then very firmly on the no, this gospel calls us to be out there, and on the barricades. Yeah. But I feel like one of the things that makes her in particular powerful is that she was really nice. And so she wasn't a firebrand. She wasn't, we all know activists who are, right? They just kind of plow you down and you're like, I agree. She wasn't that. She was not, right? There's great activists who can actually be very interpersonally oppressive, but she wasn't. She was gentle, and she was old-fashioned, and she was pretty. And I think it made her kind of this secret weapon that you wouldn't expect. Yeah, that you wouldn't expect she had such intense thoughts. Yeah, that it was a gentle way of getting to people. So where that intense, this is my convent moment, that's a break from her usual way of being, which makes it more powerful, I think. Yeah. What else?
Did it depart at all from
things that were surprising to me. One is that her father was an Irish immigrant. He went home to Ireland to fight in the Irish Revolution against the British. It was an anti-imperial revolution in 1920, and that was a really important part of his identity and a really important part of her childhood. Hearing all his Irish rebel stories, and I didn't know that, but when I started doing the book, I was like, oh right, that's the thing about her dad. It was interesting as I've further researched her and read all of her letters, or many of her letters to her parents. That was actually very deeply integral to her understanding of Nicaragua and of El Salvador. So her last letter home on December 1st, hours before she's killed, she's talking to her parents about what's going on and the horrible conditions and the horrible, all the murders. And then she says, Dad, so much of what's going on here reminds me of what you fought for in your youth, in your struggle for the liberation of Ireland. Humans will never be at peace until they find liberation, until we find peace with God. Up Sligo. That's the last thing she wrote home. The other thing, and there's similar letters like that in the midst of the gathering Sandinista movement in the early 70s. So as the altar boys and the youth group are going off to the mountains, she says, this reminds me of what you went through, Dad. This reminds me of your struggle. Which isn't to say that she endorsed armed conflict, but she didn't not endorse it, She understood that as a moral choice that some people had to make. And she was predisposed to understand it because her father had made that same choice. The other thing that I have to say was very humblingly news to me. And when I started doing the book, I spent a lot of time educating myself on the pre-Vatican II Church, about which I have these very cartoonish ideas. And so I spent all this time in the archives of the Diocese of Brooklyn. And, so in my mind there was it used to be this way, and then in 1965 it was this way. But actually the Vatican I, which I'd always understood as a denunciation of modernity, but Vatican I there were some really incarnate, about this world, how we relate to the world things in Vatican I. And in 1919, the U.S. bishops, or what would become the U.S. bishops, came out with this social program that some people think inspired the New Deal. So it was a great education for me to study the 1920s and 30s church and realize that, of course, there was always a commitment to the real world. Of course, there was always the Catholic Charities. There were these labor schools that met in parishes, so that actually there's a thread of this sort of God's in the world, God's in the real world. We have a responsibility in the physical world, even way back. That's probably the thing that was most something I knew nothing about and then had to readjust my understanding. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you so much.